Larkspur Ridge was a town built on the bones of its own history, where the streets held more gossip than dust, and the weight of old grudges hung in the air like the dry heat that never seemed to leave. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the small shopkeepers and farmers often had more to say about their neighbors than was fit for a decent conversation. Time moved slowly in Larkspur Ridge, but the past had a way of staying in the present, lingering like a stain that couldn't be washed away. In the heart of it all was Margaret Davis, the widow who lived on the outskirts of town. She wasn't much seen in the public eye, and that suited her just fine. The townsfolk often talked about her, whispering behind closed doors, passing judgment with every glance. It wasn't just the fact that she was a widow, though that alone earned her no small amount of suspicion. No, it was the way her husband had died. It was a tragedy, no doubt a mysterious accident on the trail that took his life far too soon, but the circumstances surrounding his death remained shrouded in whispers and rumors. The official story was simple enough: a fall from his horse during a routine cattle drive. But not many in Larkspur Ridge believed that. Margaret had kept to herself ever since, turning inward and away from the town that had once looked at her with a different kind of sympathy. Now, all they saw was a widow who'd outlived her husband and whose past was as cloudy as the storm clouds that often swept in from the west. The talk was relentless. Some said she'd been the cause of her husband's death, others claimed her grief had driven her to a dark place, and there were even whispers that Margaret had been involved in something much darker, something that had killed him long before he ever took that fatal fall. But through it all, Margaret remained silent, bearing the weight of their scorn with a stoic quietness that only made the rumors worse. Thomas Clayton, a wealthy rancher with a reputation built on hard work and a no-nonsense approach to life, noticed her from a distance. He wasn't one for idle chatter or the type of gossip that filled the air in Larkspur Ridge, and he certainly wasn't interested in the undercurrents of town politics. But he couldn't help but see Margaret, even if he wanted to look away. There was something about the way she carried herself, something in the quiet defiance of her posture as she walked through town, always with her head held high, even as the whispers swirled around her. Her once beautiful face had been weathered by the years, the lines around her eyes deepened by sorrow, but there was an undeniable strength in her gaze. Margaret Davis wasn't like the others. She didn't fold under the weight of the town's judgment. She bore it with the quiet grace of someone who had long since given up expecting kindness from the world. Most of the townsfolk, when they saw her, crossed the street or looked away. But Thomas saw more. He saw the way her hands trembled when she picked up a basket of eggs at the market, the way her shoulders tensed when someone spoke her name. He saw the grief that clung to her like a second skin and the loneliness that she wore like a cloak. He couldn't explain why, but there was something about her that made him pause. He wasn't used to caring about other people's lives, especially not the ones who seemed content to keep their distance. But Margaret Davis, the widow of Larkspur Ridge, was different. She had become a fixture in his life, even if he had never spoken to her directly. He often rode past her farm on his way to the ranch, watching her work from a distance, her silhouette moving steadily in the fields. He would see her stooped low, planting seeds or gathering firewood, always with the same quiet determination. There was a kind of grace in her solitude, a beauty that was almost painful to witness. And though he'd never been one for pity, Thomas couldn't help but wonder how someone so strong had been left to carry such a heavy burden alone. The town may have turned its back on Margaret, but Thomas felt a pull in his chest that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't sympathy, exactly, nor was it some misguided notion of saving her. No, it was something deeper, a sense that, perhaps, there was more to the woman the town had condemned, more to her story than they cared to know. And so, from his place on the edge of town, Thomas Clayton watched. He watched as Margaret Davis, the widow of Larkspur Ridge, bore the weight of the world alone, her heart hidden behind the veil of silence that had become her armor. Margaret Davis had become the subject of every whispered conversation in Larkspur Ridge, a town where old grudges were nurtured like prized roses and where the past was something you could never quite outrun. Each day, as Margaret walked into town for supplies or tended to her small farm on the outskirts, the harsh stares of the townsfolk followed her. She had once been a young woman full of life and promise, but that was before the tragedy, before the whispers that tarnished her name. Now, the town's judgment seemed as inescapable as the dust that clung to the streets in the summer heat. Her late husband, a man named Elias Davis, had been a respected figure in his time. He had a reputation for being a hard-working, ambitious man, someone who had built up their small farm from nothing. But there were rumors, dark rumors that circled like vultures in the wind. It wasn't the fact that he had died. Everyone agreed that his death was tragic, was how it had happened. The story was vague, the details even more so, but the town never let go of the suspicion that Elias had not met his end by mere accident. Some believed it was the result of his reckless behavior, others whispered of a darker, more deliberate force that had brought him down. Margaret, of course, had been left to carry the burden of it all. Her husband's reputation, once a source of pride, had now become a weight around her neck. The men at the saloon often spoke of her in hushed tones, calling her a widow with a tainted past, as if that alone defined her. It was easy for them to forget the woman she had been before, to overlook the quiet strength she had once possessed. She was no longer Margaret Davis, the farmer's wife. She had become a widow with a cursed name, and that was all they saw. Though she kept to herself, tending to her animals and her small plot of land, Margaret was not left in peace. Every visit to the market or the general store brought with it the sting of whispers. At times, she could feel their eyes on her, eyes filled with scorn and judgment. She had learned to ignore it, to carry on with her daily tasks as though nothing had changed, but it was a struggle. The weight of their disdain pressed on her every time she ventured into town, and though she walked with her head held high, inside, she felt the ache of rejection. Thomas Clayton, a wealthy rancher who had lived in Larkspur Ridge for many years, had never been one to pay much attention to the gossip and drama that festered in the town. His focus had always been on his cattle and his land, on the responsibilities that came with wealth and the demands of running a large ranch. He had no time for the petty squabbles of small-town life, nor did he have any interest in getting involved in the troubles of its inhabitants. But there was something about Margaret that caught his attention, something that made him watch her from a distance. He had seen her around town many times, always keeping to herself, always quiet and reserved. There was a strange kind of resilience in her that intrigued him. Margaret was not like the other women of the town. She did not seek attention, nor did she seem to crave the approval of others. She simply went about her business, tending to her farm and her animals, with a determination that was almost palpable. It was a determination he couldn't quite understand, but felt a strange respect for nonetheless. One evening, after a long day of work, Thomas found himself in the saloon, listening to the usual round of gossip from the men who gathered there. As the night wore on, the talk turned to Margaret Davis. He sat back in his chair, his attention drifting as the men spoke, their voices low and filled with judgment. "Poor woman," one man said, shaking his head. "The whole town knows what happened. Never should have been married to him in the first place. That man was nothing but trouble." Another man, a long-time resident of the town, chimed in. "You know, they say she had a hand in it. That accident, I mean. A woman's capable of a lot more than most folks think. Maybe she had something to do with Elias's death." Thomas felt a tightening in his chest at the words, though he kept his face neutral. He wasn't one for idle rumors, but something about the way they spoke about Margaret made him uneasy. The more he heard, the more he wanted to learn the truth. He had never known Margaret to be anything but kind when their paths had crossed, and the idea that she could be guilty of something so terrible seemed hard to believe. As the evening wore on and the conversation turned to other topics, Thomas sat quietly, his mind swirling with questions. He had never taken much interest in the town's gossip before, but for some reason, Margaret's situation stirred something inside him. There was more to her than what the townsfolk saw, more to the story than the rumors that had been spread. He couldn't help but wonder what had really happened, and more importantly, why no one had ever bothered to get the full story. The next few days were filled with a strange sense of unease. Thomas found himself watching Margaret from a distance, not in a way that was obvious, but with a quiet curiosity. He would ride past her farm on his way to his own ranch, observing the way she moved, the way she interacted with her animals. It was clear to him that Margaret was alone, truly alone, not just in the sense of having no husband, but in the sense that she was isolated from the world. Though he kept his distance, Thomas felt a strange pull to help her, to right some of the wrongs that had been done to her. He had no idea how to do either, wasn't even sure what, exactly, needed to be done. But the more he thought about it, the more he knew that the whispers of the past were not enough to define a person. Margaret deserved more than to be remembered as the widow with a cursed past. She deserved the truth to be known, and perhaps, in the process, she deserved a chance to find peace again. The sun was dipping low in the sky as Thomas Clayton rode slowly through the town square, the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves the only sound against the backdrop of quiet chatter. He had just finished a long day of work at the ranch, the familiar weight of the saddle settling on his back as he made his way home. He was used to the sight of Larkspur Ridge's dusty streets, weather-beaten buildings, and the scent of wood smoke that hung in the air. It was a town that seemed to be stuck in time, where the past never really let go, and the people seemed content to live within its shadows. But as he passed the saloon, something caught his eye. A group of men had gathered in the square, their voices raised in laughter and mockery. At first, Thomas thought nothing of it. The men of Larkspur Ridge were often found in this same spot, drinking and laughing, their conversations nothing more than the usual banter. But then his eyes fell on her Margaret Davis, standing at the edge of the group, her back stiff and her hands curled tightly at her sides. The men circled her like wolves, their words harsh and pointed. Margaret stood still, her face pale but unwavering, as the men continued to taunt her. Thomas felt a knot tighten in his chest as he watched. He could see the way the men looked at her not with pity or empathy, but with cruelty. They spoke of her husband's death, of the rumors that had followed her ever since, and of the stain she had left on the town. They called her a witch, a woman cursed by her own sins. They mocked her for being alone, for standing outside their world, and for bearing a name that had become synonymous with shame. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the scene unfold. The anger inside him swelled, a fire that burned hotter with each word they threw at her. Why was no one stepping in? Why was no one putting an end to this madness? He had never been one for confrontation, never been the type to get involved in the petty squabbles of small-town life, but this was different. The sight of Margaret standing there, so alone and vulnerable, was a raw wound that cut deeper than anything he had ever seen. He spurred his horse forward, his boots striking the dusty ground with a force that seemed to snap the men out of their laughter. They turned, their faces momentarily blank before recognition set in. The group quieted, unsure of what to make of the wealthy rancher who had entered their midst. Thomas could feel the weight of their gaze, could feel the heat of their judgment, but it didn't matter. His focus was on Margaret, who stood before him like a ghost, her eyes wide but unblinking. Enough. Thomas's voice was low, but it carried, cutting through the air like a knife. He didn't raise it in anger, but the calm authority in his tone made the men hesitate. Leave her be. One of the men, a large fellow with a thick beard and a scowl that seemed permanent, sneered at him. What's this, Clayton? You're gonna stand up for the widow now? The one who killed her husband? Thomas's grip tightened on the reins, but he didn't flinch. I said, enough. His voice was sharper this time, and the challenge in it was unmistakable. The men exchanged glances, some shifting nervously, others muttering under their breath. They had underestimated Tomashad, expected him to stay out of their affairs. to turn a blind eye like the rest of the town. But Thomas was no stranger to taking charge when things went too far, and this, he knew, had gone too far. Margaret had not moved. Her face was still pale, her hands still clenched at her sides, but there was something in her eyes now, a flicker of surprise, perhaps, or the faintest glimmer of hope. For a moment, Thomas wasn't sure if she would speak, if she would finally let the walls she had built around herself crumble. But she remained silent, her gaze lowering to the ground as if she didn't want to meet his eyes. Without another word, the group of men began to disperse, grumbling amongst themselves, their sense of victory slipping away. They had no interest in taking this further, not with Thomas standing there, his posture unwavering, his presence enough to silence even the loudest of voices. As the last of the men walked off, Thomas dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. He looked at Margaret, who was still standing in the same spot, her body rigid. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft now, the anger beginning to ebb away as he focused on her. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She stood there, her eyes fixed on the dirt beneath her feet, her breath shallow. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she lifted her gaze to meet his, and for the first time since he had known her, Thomas saw something in her eyes, something more than the usual shield of indifference. It was gratitude, maybe, but it was also something deeper, something she had kept buried for a long time. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure if she truly believed that she was fine. He didn't speak again, but there was a silence between them, an understanding that had formed in that brief, charged moment. As he turned to leave, the weight of the town's judgment still hung in the air, but for the first time, Thomas wasn't sure he cared. The town had failed, Margrethe had seen it with his own eyes. And he realized then that he couldn't stand by any longer, couldn't watch her face this torment alone. There was more to this than simply helping her with her struggles. This was about righting a wrong that had festered for far too long. And as he walked away, his resolve hardened. The day of reckoning had come, and Thomas Clayton was not going to stand idly by any longer. The morning was still cool when Thomas rode his horse toward Margaret's farm, the early light of the sun casting long shadows across the land. The air was thick with the scent of earth and dew, a quiet peace settling over the valley. The ride was familiar, the path worn down by years of use, but today, for the first time, Thomas felt a sense of purpose as he approached the small, weather-beaten farmhouse on the outskirts of town. It had been a week since he'd stood in the square, watching as the town had torn Margaret down with their words, and the memory of her silent suffering still gnawed at him. He knew he couldn't keep his distance any longer. As he drew closer, he saw her in the distance, bent over a pile of wood near the barn. Her hands moved with methodical precision, stacking the logs with care as if each one was a burden she had learned to bear over the years. Thomas slowed his horse as he neared, watching her for a moment. There was something in the way she worked that told him she wasn't just a woman trying to survive. She was a woman who had been living with the weight of solitude for so long that it had become part of her. The same quiet strength he had seen in her before was there now, but it was tempered by the exhaustion that had settled in her bones. Thomas dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post. He took a deep breath, preparing himself for what he had to do. He had never been good at offering help to others, never been the type to get involved in people's struggles, but something about Margaret had made him want to change that. He approached her slowly, his boots soft on the dirt, as he crossed the yard. "Morning, Margaret," he called, his voice carrying across the quiet space. She froze for a moment, her hands still on the wood, and then straightened slowly, her back stiff as she turned to face him. There was no surprise in her expression, no softness. Her gaze was wary, guarded, as though she expected nothing but trouble from anyone who came her way. "What do you want, Thomas?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Thomas hesitated, taken aback by the sharpness of her words, but he pushed forward. "I thought you could use a hand," he said, gesturing toward the pile of wood she had been working on. I'm sure it's a lot for one person to manage. Margaret's eyes narrowed, studying him with a skepticism that made his heart tighten. She had no reason to trust him, he knew that. The town had turned its back on her, and for all she knew, Thomas was just another man who would offer her help with strings attached, another person who would expect something in return. She had been let down too many times to believe that anyone would truly offer help without wanting something more. I can manage just fine on my own, she replied, her voice colder now, and her fingers tightened around the wood she was holding. Thomas felt the sting of her rejection, but he refused to back down. He had seen enough, and he wasn't about to leave her to suffer in silence any longer. I'm not asking for anything in return, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I just want to help. You're doing all this alone, and it's clear you're tired. I don't know why the others aren't doing their part, but I can. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Thomas could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. For a moment, there was silence between them, and he could feel the weight of her hesitation, the wall she had built around herself that no one had been able to break down. It was a wall made of pain and mistrust, and it was clear that she was reluctant to let anyone in. Why would you want to help me? She asked after a long pause, her voice quiet, almost as though she were speaking to herself. Thomas shifted on his feet, his gaze steady. Because it's the right thing to do. You don't deserve to carry all this on your own. Margaret's lips pressed together in a thin line, and she let out a small, humorless laugh. The right thing to do, she repeated. And what does that mean? No one else has helped me. They've all turned their backs. Why would you be any different? Thomas felt a pang of guilt in his chest at the rawness in her voice, but he didn't falter. Maybe I'm not different, he said, his words steady but earnest. Maybe I'm just someone who sees you for who you are not, for what the town thinks you are. Her gaze softened slightly at his words, but she didn't immediately respond. Thomas watched her, knowing that this moment could go either way. He wasn't asking her to trust him, not yet. But he had to do something. He couldn't stand by and watch her fight this battle alone any longer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Margaret gave a slow, reluctant nod. I won't need your help forever, she said, her voice quiet, and though her tone was still guarded, there was a hint of gratitude in her eyes. I don't expect you to, Thomas replied, his voice gentle, just today. Margaret didn't say anything more, but she turned back toward the woodpile, her shoulders stiff but her movements less hurried. Thomas stepped forward, taking his place beside her, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't push him away. The silence between them was comfortable, not forced, and as they worked side by side, Thomas couldn't help but notice the small shift in the air, the fragile beginning of trust, born from nothing more than a quiet offer to help. Days passed, and as Thomas spent more time helping Margaret, he began to see the quiet, unspoken toll that the years had taken on her. At first, the work was simple enough, mending fences, tending to the barn, carrying firewood. But as they worked side by side, something deeper began to unfold. He could see it in the way she held herself, her shoulders always slightly hunched, as if she were constantly bracing herself against an invisible storm. Her movements were efficient, but there was a hesitation to everything she did, a wariness that seemed ingrained in her. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that had settled in her bones, it was the weariness of someone who had been tested by a world that had never shown her any kindness. Thomas began to notice the subtle signs, the way her gaze would flicker nervously when someone came too close, how she would flinch if a loud noise startled her, as if she feared being hurt once more. The fear in her eyes, though fleeting, was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. It wasn't something he had seen in her before, not when they had first met. But now, it was impossible to ignore. Margaret never spoke of her past, not the man she had loved, or the loss that still clung to her like a shadow, but it was clear to Thomas that she was haunted. The stories the town had told about her husband's death were just the beginning. He could feel the weight of the town's judgment pressing on her every day, suffocating her, holding her back from ever being free of the ghosts that lived in their words. The cruel treatment she had endured, the endless whispers and stares, had carved deep scars into her soul, scars that no amount of time or distance could heal. She rarely spoke of her late husband, Elias. When she did, it was with the same cold detachment she reserved for everything else. The mention of his name seemed to draw a veil over her, shutting him out, as if she feared that by remembering him, she would be forced to relive the pain that came with his death. Thomas understood, but he also saw something else, something that gnawed at him as he spent more time around her. The town had told him one version of the story, that Elias Davis had died in an accident, a tragic but ultimately simple event. The official story had always been that he had fallen from his horse during a cattle drive, but Thomas couldn't help but feel that the truth was more complicated than that. The way the town spoke of him, the way they had turned Margaret into an outcast, it all felt wrong. There was something in the way they had discarded her, in the way they whispered about her as though she were the cause of her husband's death. They had condemned her without ever knowing the full story, and that made Thomas angry. As the days wore on, he began to ask more questions, seeking answers where there had been only silence. He didn't push her, not directly, but little by little, he learned more about the shadows of her past. There were cracks in her stoic exterior, moments when she would let something slip, a quiet word here, a half-remembered detail there. He picked up on them, like fragments of a puzzle he was determined to piece together. Every time he saw her recoil, every time her eyes darkened with the weight of a memory she refused to let go of, Thomas felt his resolve harden. He needed to know the truth. But Margaret remained distant. Even as they grew accustomed to each other's presence, a certain line was always there, unspoken but clear. She resisted forming any real connection with him, afraid to trust, afraid of being let down once more. Her fear of the town's cruelty was tangible, and Thomas could see how it had woven itself into the very fabric of her being. She kept her distance, never allowing herself to get too close, never allowing herself to rely on him. It was as though she had decided, long ago, that trusting anyone was a dangerous thing, a lesson learned from the people who had turned their backs on her, from the town that had condemned her for something she had never asked for. Thomas knew, deep down, that he was slowly earning her trust, even if she didn't admit it. She had stopped flinching every time he approached, and while her words were still guarded, her silence no longer felt like a wall. But he also knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. She was still haunted by the past, still held captive by the shame the town had heaped upon her. It wasn't something she would let go of easily. One evening, as they sat together in the dim light of the farmhouse, Thomas broached the subject that had been weighing on him for days. "Margaret," he began, his voice gentle, "I don't believe everything the town says about you." Her eyes flickered, her expression unreadable, but she said nothing. "I don't think your husband's death was as simple as they make it sound," Thomas continued. "There's more to this than what they're telling." Margaret's shoulders tensed, and she turned her gaze away, staring into the fire that crackled softly in the hearth. "It doesn't matter," she said quietly. "It's in the past." "It matters to me," Thomas replied, his voice steady. "You don't deserve to carry the weight of their lies." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the fire, the crackling of the wood, and the soft sighs of the night settling in around them. Margaret didn't speak, but Thomas could see the tension in her posture, the way her hands clenched at her sides. It was clear she wasn't ready to confront the truth, not yet. And maybe she never would be. But Thomas knew that if he could uncover the truth, if he could clear her name, it might be the first step toward freeing her from the prison the town had built around her. He didn't press her further, but his determination only grew stronger. The town had wronged her, and he wouldn't let that injustice stand. He would find the truth, for her and for himself. Thomas had always been a man of action, someone who dealt with problems as they came, without dwelling on them for too long. But there was something about Margaret that gnawed at him, something he couldn't shake. Her stoic silence, the way she kept her distance, the guarded sorrow that lingered in her eyes, he knew there was more to her story than she let on. And as the days passed, he found himself increasingly unsettled by the questions that surrounded her husband's death. He couldn't keep ignoring the whispers in the town, the ones that painted Margaret as a woman who had something to do with her own husband's tragic end. No one had ever bothered to question the town's narrative, but Thomas wasn't like the others. He couldn't simply accept it. So, he began to dig. At first, it was subtle. He asked around, casually mentioning Elias's name in passing to a few of the old men who frequented the saloon, trying to gauge their reactions. The responses were what he expected: hesitant, uncomfortable, tinged with the same old rumors that had been circulating for years. Accident, they said. Nothing more to it. But Thomas sensed there was more to the story, more than what the town was willing to admit. A week later, Thomas found himself driving deeper into the past, visiting the old friends of the Davis family who still lived on the outskirts of town. He had heard snippets of their stories over the years, vague details about Elias and Margaret before everything had fallen apart. One man, an aging farmer named Paul, had known Elias before his death. He was the first to speak openly, though still guarded. Elias was a good man, but he had a temper, Paul told him, his voice low and reluctant. You wouldn't know it by looking at him. He could charm a rattlesnake out of its skin. But there were moments when he was different. Some folks around here thought his temper got the best of him sometimes. Thomas's brow furrowed. What do you mean by different? Paul hesitated, casting a glance around as if to make sure no one was listening. Elias had some bad blood with a few folks. I wouldn't go around talking about it, but it wasn't all as innocent as people like to think. There were rumors about him and Margaret, too. They weren't as happy as they let on. And that night, well, it wasn't an accident. The words hit Thomas harder than he expected. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of conversations, of gossip he had overheard in the town. He had always assumed Elias's death had been some kind of tragic mistake, a freak accident. But now, the walls around that story began to crumble. You think someone had it out for him? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Paul didn't answer immediately. He stared at the ground, rubbing his hand over his jaw. I don't know, but I do know one thing. Elias had enemies, and they weren't just the kind you deal with in business. I wouldn't put it past someone to make sure he never came back from that drive. Thomas left Paul's farm with a heavy heart. His suspicions had been confirmed, though in a way he had never expected. Elias's death had not been a simple accident. It had been an event colored by betrayal, jealousy, and a long-buried resentment that no one in Larkspur Ridge had ever bothered to dig into. But there was more to it, more that still needed to be uncovered. Over the next few days, Thomas spoke to a few more people, each one offering a little more information, though no one seemed willing to give him a full picture. But the pieces were beginning to fit together. He learned that Elias had been involved in a dispute with a local rancher over land, a dispute that had grown more personal over time. The other rancher had a reputation for being ruthless, and it seemed that he and Elias had clashed more than once before the fateful cattle drive. The more Thomas learned, the clearer it became that Elias had not died by chance. He had been involved in something much darker, a plot that involved more than just a rivalry over land. There were rumors of money changing hands, debts that had been left unpaid, and a betrayal that ran deeper than he had ever imagined. Margaret, it seemed, had been caught in the middle of all of it. Thomas knew he had to confront her. He couldn't continue carrying the weight of this secret, not when it was clear that Margaret had been unjustly blamed for her husband's death. The town had made her into a pariah, their cruelty amplified by their ignorance, and he couldn't let that stand. That evening, after the sun had set and the ranch was quiet, Thomas rode out to Margaret's farm once more. He found her outside, sitting on the porch, the light from the house casting long shadows across the ground. She was alone, as she often was, her face softened by the glow of the lantern. He dismounted and walked over to her, his steps heavy with the burden of the truth he was about to reveal. Margaret looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Margaret," Thomas began, his voice thick with the weight of the words he had to say. "I've been asking around about Elias, about what really happened." She stiffened, the tension in her posture rising immediately. "Why?" she asked, her voice sharp, defensive. "Because I don't believe the town's version of the story," he said, his tone firm. "There's more to it, Margaret. Your husband didn't die by accident." Margaret's eyes flickered with something fear, perhaps, or resignation, and she stood up, her movements slow but deliberate. "I don't want to hear it, Thomas," she said quietly, turning her back to him. "It's in the past, let it be." Thomas stepped forward, his heart pounding. "I can't let it go. Not when I know the truth could clear your name. You've been carrying this burden alone for too long." For a long moment, Margaret didn't respond. She stood there, her back to him, her head bowed slightly as if weighing the words in her mind. Finally, she turned, her face softening for the briefest of moments. "I don't need anyone to clear my name," she said, her voice steady but weary. "I just need to be left alone." But Thomas could see it. Noe had broken through, if only just a crack. She was listening. And though she wasn't ready to face the truth, she knew, deep down, that the story she had carried all these years was about to unravel. And with it, so too would the walls she had built around herself. The air between them was thick with unspoken words as Thomas stood in front of Margaret, his heart pounding in his chest. He had known this moment was coming, but even as he prepared for it, he wasn't ready for the weight it carried. The truth he had uncovered had been a heavy burden to bear, but now, standing in front of the woman who had been the center of it all, he realized just how much she had been carrying all this time. The walls she had built around herself were high and thick, and they had been there for a reason, because to let anyone in, to let anyone see what lay beneath, would mean facing the pain she had buried for so long. Margaret had been quiet since he had told her what he had learned about her husband, Elias. She hadn't said a word, hadn't even looked at him. Her eyes were downcast, her hands clenched at her sides, as if the very mention of his name had summoned a memory too painful to relive. Thomas could feel the tension radiating from her, the way she pulled back from him, shutting herself off even further. But he couldn't stop now. He couldn't let her continue to carry the weight of the lies that had been told about her. "Margaret," Thomas said, his voice steady but insistent, "you've been running from this for too long. You can't keep hiding from the truth." She flinched at his words, her shoulders stiffening, but she didn't turn to face him. He stepped closer, his voice softening. "I know what happened, Margaret. I know it wasn't an accident. I know what your husband did, and I know it's been eating away at you for years." Her breath hitched, and for a brief moment, Thomas thought she might break. But instead, she shook her head, her lips pressed tight. "You don't know anything," she whispered, her voice tight with the effort to hold back the emotions she had long kept locked away. "I know enough," Thomas replied, stepping closer still, his voice gentle but unwavering. "I know that Elias wasn't the man everyone thinks he was. He wasn't the hero they painted him to be. I know he made mistakes, and I know those mistakes cost him his life." Margaret's eyes shot up then, filled with a mixture of fear and anger. She took a step back, her arms wrapping around herself as if to shield herself from the truth he was offering. "Stop," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't want to talk about this. I can't talk about this. You don't understand. You don't know what it was like." Thomas took a deep breath, knowing he had to press on, knowing he couldn't let her bury this any longer. "I understand more than you think. I know you're carrying guilt that isn't yours to carry, and I know you're afraid of what people will think when they hear the truth. But you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Margaret's face twisted with pain, and for the first time, Thomas saw the rawness of her grief, the way it had eaten her alive from the inside out. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her hands trembling as she finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep sorrow that made his heart ache. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Elias, he wasn't a bad man, not at first. He was kind, he was loving, but he changed. And I didn't know how to stop it. He got involved with the wrong people. People who used him, who took advantage of him. And he made a deal. A dangerous one. He was so blinded by the need to prove himself, to show everyone he could make something of himself, that he didn't see what it was costing him. He didn't see what it was costing me. Her voice broke, and Thomas could see the tears welling up in her eyes, the years of pent-up pain that had finally found their release. He was reckless. He pushed me away and… She stopped, her hands shaking as she wiped her eyes, but the words continued to spill out, raw and unfiltered. I couldn't stop him. And when that night came, when he went out on that ride, he was already dead long before the fall. The fall was just the final act of a man who had already destroyed everything. The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw, and Thomas could feel the weight of it settle between them. Margaret had been carrying that burden for so long, believing that she was somehow complicit in her husband's death, believing that the guilt of not being able to save him was hers to bear. The town had never seen the truth, had never bothered to look deeper than the surface. They had cast their judgment on her, not knowing the whole story, not knowing how she had tried to fight for the man she loved even as he spiraled out of control. Thomas took a step closer, his heart aching for her, for the years of isolation and pain she had endured. You didn't cause his death, Margaret. You didn't make him do any of that. He chose his path, and it cost him everything. You're not responsible for that. You're not responsible for what happened to him, and you're not responsible for the lies that people have told about you. Margaret's breath came in ragged sobs now, the weight of the truth finally crashing over her. The years of fear, of rejection, of living under the shadow of her husband's mistakes, had finally broken her. And Thomas, though he didn't have all the answers, knew that this moment was the beginning of something new for her, a chance at redemption, a chance to finally be free from the town's cruelty. He reached out then, his hand gentle on her arm, and when she looked up at him, her eyes filled with both sorrow and a flicker of hope, he whispered the words she needed to hear. I'll protect you, Margaret. You don't have to face this alone anymore. For the first time in years, Margaret let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a future where she wasn't defined by the past. And in that moment, as the truth was laid bare between them, she allowed herself to hope. The air was still, the quiet of the night broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Thomas stood in the yard of Margaret's farmhouse, his boots shifting on the dry earth as he looked toward the porch where she sat, her silhouette faint against the dim light spilling from the house. The stars above were clear and sharp, but they seemed far away, distant, much like the world Margaret had been forced to live in for so long. He watched her for a moment longer, her head slightly bowed, as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders, and in many ways, it did. The judgment, the whispers, the rejection from a town that had never understood her. Thomas couldn't bear it anymore. He couldn't stand to see her suffer like this, locked in a cage of her own grief and the cruel condemnation of others. Weeks had passed since their confrontation, since the day Margaret had finally let the truth spill from her lips. Since then, they had settled into a routine of sorts. Thomas came to her farm every day, not out of duty or obligation, but because he wanted to be there. To help, yes, but also to offer her something she had long since given up on, his quiet presence, his unwavering support. They worked side by side, day after day, and as time passed, Thomas found himself more and more drawn to her. The way she moved with grace despite her scars, the quiet strength in the way she faced the world despite everything it had thrown at her. He had never believed in fairy tales, but he had come to realize that there was something extraordinary about Margaret, something worth fighting for. But now, standing there in the cool night air, he knew he could no longer stand by without offering her a way out. He couldn't just keep helping her, keeping her company in silence. He had to do something more, something that might give her the peace she so desperately deserved. And as he stood there looking at her, the words formed in his mind, and before he could second-guess himself, he moved toward her, his heart pounding with a nervousness he had never expected. "Margaret," he began, his voice steady but filled with an intensity he couldn't hide. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable, but he could see the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the edge of the porch. "I know you've been through hell," Thomas said, the words thick with emotion. "I know the town has made you feel small, made you feel like you don't matter. But I want you to know this: you matter. You've always mattered, and you deserve better than this life of fear and isolation. You deserve peace." Margaret's gaze softened slightly, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I can't change what's happened, Margaret. I can't undo the wrongs that have been done to you. But I can offer you something else. I can offer you a chance to leave all of that behind. A chance to start over. To live a life free from the cruelty of this town." She blinked, her face flickering with confusion. "What are you saying, Thomas?" His heart beat faster, his palms suddenly clammy as he took a deep breath. "I'm offering to marry you." The words hung in the air between them, as heavy as the silence that followed. Margaret didn't speak immediately, her eyes wide with shock, her breath caught in her throat. She looked at him as though she had heard him wrong, as though the words didn't quite make sense. "Marry me?" she asked, her voice small, barely a whisper. "But why? After everything I've done, after everything I've been through, why would you want to marry me?" Thomas stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Because I want to protect you, Margaret. Because I care about you, and I can't bear to see you suffer any longer. Because you don't deserve to live like this, with the weight of the world on your shoulders. I can't promise you a perfect life, but I can promise you that I'll stand by you. That you won't have to face this world alone anymore." Margaret shook her head, a small, bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You don't understand. I can't trust anyone anymore. Not after everything I've been through, and I certainly don't deserve happiness. Not after what happened." "You do deserve happiness," Thomas said, his voice firm now, a quiet resolve settling into his words. "You've spent so many years believing that you don't, but you do. You deserve peace, and you deserve someone who will fight for you. That's what I'm offering. A chance for you to be free. A chance to live without the weight of the town's judgment, without the fear that follows you wherever you go." Margaret looked away, her gaze fixed on the ground as she processed his words. Thomas could see the conflict in her, the struggle between wanting to believe in something better and the deep-seated fear that had been ingrained in her for so long. She was terrified, and rightfully so. Trusting someone again was a risk she wasn't sure she was ready to take. "I don't know if I can," she murmured, almost to herself. "I've been alone for so long, Thomas. I don't know if I can trust you. I don't know if I can trust anyone again." Thomas knelt down in front of her, his hand resting on the steps of the porch as he looked up into her eyes. "I'm not asking you to trust me right away," he said gently. "I'm asking you to take a chance. A chance to move forward, to leave the past behind and build something new. With me, we can go at your pace, but I'll be here, and I'll protect you. No one can hurt you when I'm around." Margaret's breath hitched as she looked down at him, her eyes welling with tears. She wiped them away quickly, almost angrily, but Thomas saw the vulnerability in her expression, the fear, the longing, the quiet desire to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for her. "I've never known anything other than pain," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I've never known anything other than betrayal. How can I believe in something good again?" Thomas reached out then, gently taking her hand in his grip firm and reassuring. "Because you're not alone anymore, and you don't have to carry the burden of the past any longer. Let me help you. Let me show you what it's like to feel safe again. What it's like to trust." For a long moment, Margaret stood there, her eyes locked on his. She was silent, caught between fear and hope, uncertainty and the yearning for something better. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded, the smallest of movements. But it was enough. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Okay, I'll marry you." The words hung in the air, a fragile promise, but to Thomas, it was the beginning of everything. He smiled, his heart swelling with emotion, knowing that, at last, they had taken the first step toward something better for both of them. The morning of the wedding was crisp, the sky a soft blue that promised a peaceful day. At Thomas's ranch, the air was filled with the scent of freshly cut flowers and the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees. It was a quiet day, a far cry from the usual hustle of ranch work, and yet there was an underlying sense of anticipation, a sense that something important was about to take place. The ceremony was small, nothing grand, just a handful of people, yet the weight of what it represented hung heavily in the air. Margaret stood in the small, simple room of the ranch house, her hands resting nervously in front of her. She had never imagined this day would come, not like this, not in the way Thomas had brought it about. It felt surreal to be standing there in the dress he had chosen for her, simple and elegant, with delicate lace and soft fabric that made her feel both fragile and beautiful in ways she hadn't known were possible. The dress was nothing like the one she had once dreamed of wearing for a wedding, but today, it didn't matter. What mattered was the man who had chosen her, the man who had fought for her when no one else would. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The past, the judgment, the whispers, the cruelty felt like a shadow, something she had carried with her for far too long. But today, as she stood here, there was a sense of something new, something different. She wasn't just marrying Thomas, she was marrying herself, the woman she had forgotten she could be, the woman who deserved happiness, who deserved peace. Thomas stood just outside, waiting. He had never expected this kind of day, never imagined he would be standing at the altar with Margaret by his side. But there was a calmness in his chest, a certainty that had been growing since the moment he had made the offer. He had seen her, really, seen her in ways no one else had. He had seen the strength beneath the layers of fear, the resilience buried deep inside, and he had come to care for her in ways that went beyond simple affection. It was more than that. It was a quiet respect, an understanding that they were both fighting for something greater than just survival. They were fighting for each other, for a future that they could build together. The ceremony took place under the shade of an old oak tree near the house, a simple altar made from wild flowers and twine. There were no extravagant decorations, no fancy music. The only witnesses were a few of the ranch hands, some of the few people from town who had stood by Thomas through the years, but the rest of Larkspur Ridge was absent. Not a single familiar face from the town had come. It didn't surprise Thomas. He knew they wouldn't. They had never accepted Margaret, and they certainly wouldn't accept the idea of her marrying the man they had come to see as a defender of someone so undeserving in their eyes. As Thomas and Margaret stood together, the officiant, a kind-hearted man from a neighboring ranch, spoke the words of the ceremony in a low, steady voice. The words felt like a promise, like a shield against the cruel voices of the past. Thomas's gaze never left Margaret's face. He saw the slight tremble in her hands, the way her eyes darted nervously to the side. But he also saw the way she stood, her back straight, her chin lifted slightly, as though for the first time in years, she was letting go of the weight that had held her down for so long. When it came time for the vows, Margaret's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of everything she had endured. "I stand here today," she began, "not just as your wife, but as the woman I've always wanted to be. I stand beside you, not because I have to, but because I choose to. You've shown me something I didn't believe I deserved: peace, respect, and love. For that, and for everything else, I promise to stand by you for as long as I live." Thomas smiled, the corners of his mouth softening as he listened to her words. He had expected something less, expected her to say something hesitant, something unsure. But her words rang with strength, and for the first time, he saw the woman who had been buried beneath the town's judgment, the woman who had been lost in the shadows of a past that didn't belong to her. "I've never asked for much in this life," he said, his voice low and steady, But I've always known that what matters is the people you stand with, the ones who fight alongside you. I fought for you, Margaret, because I believe in you. I believe in us. I promise to protect you, to love you, and to stand by you no matter what comes our way." The vows were simple, but the promises they carried were deep, binding them together in a way that felt both fragile and unbreakable. And when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, there was a brief, quiet moment where everything felt still, as if the world had paused to bear witness to something that had been a long time coming. Margaret, now Thomas's bride, stood tall beside him, her posture proud and strong. The town had never accepted her. But here, in this small, intimate ceremony, she was no longer the woman they had condemned. She was something more. She was someone who had claimed her own peace, her own worth. The whispers that had followed her for so long would not stop just because she had married. But Margaret knew, now, that she didn't need their approval. Not anymore. She was free, and she would not let the town define her. She stood with her husband, her eyes meeting his, and in that quiet moment, she understood that this union was not just about love, it was about reclaiming herself, reclaiming her life. And with that understanding, Margaret finally felt whole. The rest of the day passed in a blur, a quiet celebration of two people who had found something worth fighting for. But as they danced beneath the stars that night, the world outside the ranch faded into the distance, and all that mattered was the life they would now build together. A life free from the chains of the past. A life of hope. A life of peace. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the hills, casting long shadows across the land, as Thomas and Margaret stood together at the edge of the ranch. The vastness of the open plains stretched before them, endless and inviting, a symbol of the new life they were beginning to build. The ranch, once a place of work and solitude for Thomas, had become something entirely different now. It had transformed into a home, both a refuge and a sanctuary, where he and Margaret could leave behind the burdens of their pasts and find peace in each other. The town, of course, had not changed. The gossip, the whispered judgments, and the cold stares still followed them whenever they ventured into Larkspur Ridge, but none of it mattered anymore. Margaret had stopped caring what the townsfolk thought. She no longer felt the weight of their cruelty, the judgment that had been heaped upon her for so long. She had found something more important than their approval. She had found herself, and she had found Thomas, the man who had stood by her, who had fought for her when no one else had. With him, she no longer felt the need to hide, no longer felt the need to bend under the weight of their words. As the days passed, Margaret found a peace that had once seemed impossible. The work on the ranch was hard, but it felt different now. She didn't do it alone anymore. She had Thomas beside her, his steady presence, a comfort, and a strength. The days were filled with the rhythm of routine, feeding the animals, tending to the crops, fixing fences, and yet each moment was infused with something new. There was no longer any isolation, no longer the constant weight of judgment. There was only the quiet, steady bond that had grown between them, one that deepened with every shared glance, every word of encouragement, every touch. For the first time in years, Margaret felt truly alive. Her confidence, once fragile and broken, began to return. It wasn't just the love Thomas had shown her that lifted her. It was the realization that she was no longer a woman defined by her past. She was Margaret Clayton now, Thomas's wife, a woman who had faced the darkest parts of herself and come out stronger on the other side. And with each passing day, as they worked side by side on the land they had made their own, she realized that she was not just surviving anymore, she was thriving. Thomas, too, felt the shift. The ranch, once a place of solitude and work, had become a home, a place of warmth and laughter, filled with the quiet joy that Margaret brought into his life. He had never known that love could be so fulfilling, so steady. He had loved her in his own way from the moment he had first seen her, but now, as they spent their days together, he saw her not just as the woman who had endured so much, but as the woman she had become, the woman who had found her strength, her voice. She was no longer the widow the town had whispered about. She was his equal, his partner, and he couldn't have been prouder of her. Together, they faced the future, knowing that the road ahead would not always be easy. There would be challenges, of course there always were, in life and in love. The town would never fully accept Margaret, not in the way they had once accepted Thomas. The whispers would continue, the judgment would remain, but it no longer mattered. They had each other, and that was enough. Margaret's strength came not just from the protection Thomas provided, but from her own resilience. She had learned to stand tall again, to face the world with a new sense of purpose. The love Thomas had shown her had been a catalyst, but it was her own courage, her own determination to move forward, that had brought her the peace she now felt. She had learned to trust again, not just Thomas, but herself. In the evenings, as the sky turned dark and the stars appeared in the vast expanse above them, Thomas and Margaret would sit on the porch of their home, side by side, their hands intertwined. They would watch the world around them, knowing that they had built something special, something that no one, not even the town, could take away. There was solace in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the land they had come to love. And there was hope in the future, a future they would face together, as equals, as partners, with nothing but the promise of tomorrow. The ranch, once a place of work, was now a symbol of their new beginning, a place where love, resilience, and hope had taken root. Margaret no longer saw herself as the broken woman from Larkspur Ridge. She saw herself as strong, as capable, as someone worthy of love, of peace. And as she sat beside Thomas, watching the sky fade from blue to purple to black, she realized that her past no longer defined her. The shadows of the town's judgment had faded, and in their place was a future full of light, a future she would face, not in fear, but with a strength she had only just begun to understand. Together, they had created something beautiful. Together, they had found a new life, and that life, free from the shadows of the past, was all they needed.